Pierre Robert dies. Philadelphia radio personality for 93.3 WMMR found dead in his home. It began as an ordinary Philadelphia morning, gray skies over the skyline, traffic humming along the Schuylkill Expressway, the same soundtrack of life that had played under Pierre Robert's voice for more than 4 decades. Then, just after dawn, the airwaves of 93.3 WMMR fell silent. No laughter, no music, no familiar greeting of "Good morning, beautiful people." That silence didn't just mark the absence of a DJ, it marked the loss of a heartbeat. For the first time in memory, Philadelphia's mornings felt hollow. Cars slowed as listeners tuned in, expecting Pierre's warmth, only to be met with a trembling announcement. The city's beloved radio legend had been found dead in his home. Across the region, people stopped what they were doing. Some cried. Others turned up their radios, replaying old shows as if keeping his spirit alive through static. At the WMMR studio, fans gathered, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes taped to the glass. The words were always the same: "You got us through it all." But what came next would turn grief into something transcendent. In a farewell planned by Pierre himself, the man who had given his life to connection would deliver one final broadcast, a message that would echo across the world and prove that even after death, some voices never fade. Before his name became synonymous with Philadelphia radio, before his laugh became the city's unofficial morning anthem, Pierre Robert was simply a dreamer chasing frequencies. He wasn't born into fame or fortune. He built it one late-night broadcast, one record spin, one genuine moment of connection at a time. To understand what the city lost, you first have to understand the man it loved. Pierre's world was small at first, a boy in California who fell in love with the radio not because of who was speaking, but because of how it felt, the intimacy of it, the idea that a voice could fill a room and make you feel less alone. He once said in an interview, "Radio is magic. It's the sound of someone keeping you company in the dark." That belief would guide everything he did. In the late 1970 seconds, Pierre hitchhiked across the country with nothing but a van, a few records, and a notebook filled with quotes and song lyrics. He slept in parking lots outside concerts, scribbling down the names of bands that inspired him. The Who, Led Zeppelin, The Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, the soundtrack of his youth. It was there, under the glow of neon and the hum of car engines, that he started to imagine what his voice might sound like on the other side of the dial. By the early 1980 seconds, that dream became reality when he landed a job at WMMR, a rock station already legendary in Philadelphia for giving a voice to the counterculture. But what Pierre brought was different. He wasn't just another DJ reading lines or introducing tracks. He was a storyteller, a philosopher, and a friend. His style was warm, meandering, and completely unscripted. He could segue from talking about a Led Zeppelin B-side to sharing a personal story about missing a bus in college, and somehow, it all made sense. In those final years, his broadcasts became more reflective. He spoke about time, how fast it moves, how music marks our lives like timestamps. He shared memories of youth, of love, of concerts that shaped him. To many listeners, these stories felt nostalgic, but to those who listened closely, they felt like a quiet farewell. When he said, "If you can still hear my voice, I'm still with you," no one knew that it was more than a poetic phrase. It was a promise. Because soon, Pierre's voice would leave the airwaves for good, but not before he found a way to make sure it would never truly fade. It was a Sunday morning that began like any other, the soft hum of static before sunrise, the faint sound of church bells drifting through the city. In the quiet suburbs of Philadelphia, Pierre Robert's home sat still under a blanket of pale light. The neighbors, used to hearing music from his open windows, noticed only silence, no hum of a record player, no radio voice warming the air, just the stillness that comes before a heartbreak. Pierre had not shown up for his usual weekend check-in at the station, a routine he had never missed in decades. At first, no one worried. Maybe he'd overslept, they thought. Maybe he was finally giving himself a rare morning off. But by mid-morning, calls went unanswered, texts left unread, and that's when unease began to creep in, quiet but unmistakable. His producer, John Casper, was the first to drive over. He'd been with Pierre for more than 20 years, through every milestone, every broadcast. He'd seen the long nights, the laughter, the fatigue. But nothing could prepare him for the sight that awaited him that day. Pierre's house felt frozen in time, the coffee pot half full, a stack of vinyls on the counter, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, The Who, his favorites. On the table sat a mug that read, "Good morning, beautiful people." The air smelled faintly of incense and old wood, like a studio that had gone to sleep mid-song. John called his name. Once, twice. Then, silence. By the time paramedics arrived, the inevitable had already happened. Pierre Robert, the man whose voice had been Philadelphia's constant companion for over 4 decades, had passed away in his sleep, peacefully, quietly, like the soft fade-out of a perfect record. News of his death broke just after 8 a.m., announced live on 93.3 WMMR by the station's morning host, his voice trembling as he spoke. "We have some difficult news to share this morning. Our dear friend, our family, our brother, Pierre Robert, has passed away." Those words echoed across the city like thunder. Within minutes, the phone lines at WMMR crashed. Listeners flooded social media with disbelief. "This can't be real," one fan wrote. "I just heard his voice yesterday." In the streets, cars pulled over as drivers turned up the volume, hoping to hear something more, something that would make it untrue. The station responded by replaying Pierre's final broadcast, a show filled with laughter, music, and that now haunting sign-off. "If you can still hear my voice, then I'm still with you." Philadelphia stopped that morning, the same city that had danced, worked, and lived to Pierre's soundtracks fell still. Bars turned down their televisions. Restaurants switched from sports channels to WMMR. People gathered wherever they could. Parking lots, sidewalks, cafes, radios tuned in, united in grief. At the station, the mood was surreal. Pierre's chair sat empty, his headphones still hanging from the mic stand. The red on-air light blinked softly, as if waiting for him to return. One of the younger interns left a note taped to his console that read, "Thank you for keeping us company." By noon, the building's front entrance was covered in flowers, candles, and photographs. Someone placed a guitar pick at the door. Another left an old record sleeve with the words, "Keep talking, Pierre." The city, it seemed, was talking back, trying to fill the void with love. But amid the mourning, whispers began to spread that Pierre had left something behind, something planned. His family, who had known of his declining health, hinted that his farewell had already been written, not on paper, but on tape. They revealed that Pierre had recorded a message months earlier, "For when the day comes," he had said, a message that would air not on the radio, but at his funeral. In the days leading up to the service, the anticipation grew. Fans speculated what it might contain. A thank you? A goodbye? A joke? No one knew. But everyone agreed on one thing: if anyone could make death feel like a song instead of a tragedy, it was Pierre Robert. As plans were made for the memorial, the city prepared to say farewell to its voice. The Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul, one of Philadelphia's most historic churches, offered to host the service. It was the only space large enough for the crowd they expected. The mayor's office confirmed that streets would be closed for the event. WMMR's staff organized live coverage, calling it the last broadcast. Pierre's daughter, wife, and brother would attend, joined by rock legends, journalists, and fans who had grown up with him. And though none of them could fill his silence, they would soon realize that Pierre had already found a way to do that himself. Because when the church doors finally opened on that gray morning, and the speakers came to life. What poured out wasn't mourning. It was Pierre's voice. Not a memory, not a recording, a message. His final broadcast, the one he had recorded for them all. The morning of the funeral felt like a scene from a movie, the kind where the city itself becomes a character, heavy with grief yet glowing with memory. Gray clouds hung low over Philadelphia, and the streets around the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul were lined with people long before the service began. Some wore black suits, others came in leather jackets, band tees, and tie-dyed their own tribute to the man who had made rock and roll feel like a religion. News cameras lined the steps, but even they stayed quiet. No one wanted to break the strange, reverent stillness that had settled over the crowd. Inside, the cathedral overflowed thousands of mourners shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by candlelight and the golden glow of stained glass. At the front of the church, a massive photograph of Pierre Robert smiled down from the altar. He was captured mid-laugh, tie-dye shirt and all, his hands raised as if still greeting his listeners. Beneath it, a single microphone stood on a wooden pedestal, the same one he had used at WMMR for years. Next to it, a small wooden box rested quietly. That box contained Pierre's final wish. As the family entered, his wife, daughter, and brother walking together, the room rose in silence. They carried with them something unusual, a microphone wrapped carefully in velvet, the one Pierre had kept from his first broadcast at WMMR. It had been his companion for over 4 decades through triumphs, losses, and every laugh that echoed across the Philadelphia airwaves. Pierre's longtime producer, John Casper, took the stage first. His voice trembled as he looked out across the crowd. Pierre didn't just host a show, he began softly. He hosted our lives. The audience erupted in quiet applause, a gentle wave of acknowledgement that this was true for everyone in that room. John continued, recounting stories of their years together, the early mornings, the coffee-fueled chaos, the on-air mistakes that became inside jokes among listeners. He spoke about Pierre's ability to find beauty in the mundane, how he could turn a traffic report into a lesson about patience, or a song request into a reflection on love and time. But as John stepped back, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the cathedral. Then came the static. At first, it was faint, a low hiss, like the sound of a radio tuning between stations. Then, suddenly, a voice emerged, warm, familiar, timeless. "Hey there, beautiful people." Gasps filled the room. People covered their mouths. Others began to cry. "If you're hearing this," Pierre continued, "it means I've finally gone off air." The laughter that rippled through the crowd was immediate, soft, and bittersweet. Even in death, Pierre found a way to bring humor to heartbreak. What followed was a 12-minute audio message recorded months earlier when he first learned his illness might soon end his life. It wasn't a eulogy. It wasn't even sad. It was pure Pierre. Conversational, funny, and filled with gratitude. He joked about finally being able to sleep in after 40 years of 4 a.m. wake-ups. He teased his producer about never learning how to make coffee properly. He even laughed about what songs might be playing wherever he was now. Hopefully, not too much polka. But as the message went on, his tone softened. "Radio isn't about microphones," he said gently. "It's about connection. You, me, and the music that's all that ever mattered." That line broke the room. People sobbed openly. Some stood holding up their radios like lighters at a concert. Others simply closed their eyes, letting his voice wash over them one last time. "If you can still hear my voice," he said in closing, "then I'm still with you, somewhere between the noise and the silence." When the recording ended, there was a long pause, a silence so complete it felt like the city itself had stopped breathing. Then, softly, a single voice spoke. It was his daughter. She stepped forward, her eyes glistening, holding the same guitar Pierre had used during his charity concerts. She looked at the microphone, then out at the crowd. "Dad used to say that when words fail, music still speaks," she whispered. "So this is for him." She began to strum the opening chords of Here Comes the Sunday. The room filled with sound, quiet at first, then growing as people began to sing along. Row by row, their voices joined hers, trembling, breaking, but carrying. Even the priests behind the altar wiped their eyes. When the last chord faded, she raised the guitar toward the ceiling. "You gave your life to keep us smiling every morning," she said. "Now it's our turn to keep your frequency alive." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. It echoed off the cathedral walls like the encore of a lifetime. Outside, the song spilled into the streets. People standing blocks away sang along, their voices carried by the wind. And for a moment, just one moment, it didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a broadcast, one last show, one final sign-on from a man who refused to let silence win. That recording would go viral within hours. Shared millions of times under the hashtag number Good Morning Pierre, it became more than a tribute. It became a message, a reminder that even when a voice goes quiet, its echo can still bring people together. In the days following the funeral, Philadelphia felt suspended between mourning and motion. The sound of Pierre Robert's voice still poured through radios across the city, old broadcasts, reruns, tribute. But something deeper began to stir beneath the grief. A quiet curiosity, almost investigative in nature. People wanted to understand not just how Pierre died, but who he was when the microphone turned off. What drove him to keep broadcasting through illness? How much had he hidden behind that timeless laughter? WMMR's newsroom became the epicenter of that exploration. The same studio where Pierre had once cracked jokes and spilled coffee on the control board was now a kind of archive. Staff gathered around hard drives, tapes, and handwritten notes he had left behind decades of shows, meticulously labeled in his looping handwriting. Producers replayed his final months on air, analyzing every word as though it were a code. They noticed subtle signs, moments where Pierre paused longer than usual, where his laughter carried an almost imperceptible sadness. He had been leaving messages all along, they realized, buried in the rhythm of his banter. Detective-like in their devotion, the team uncovered audio logs and journal entries he'd saved on an external drive. Some were dated during his chemotherapy treatments recordings, where he spoke not to his listeners, but to himself. "If I sound tired tomorrow, I hope they don't notice," he whispered in one entry. "Radio's my heartbeat. If it stops, I stop." For months before his passing, Pierre had quietly battled cancer, a diagnosis he kept secret from nearly everyone outside his immediate family. His wife had begged him to rest, to step away from the mic and focus on healing, but he refused. "Someone out there needs a laugh today," he told her. "That's my medicine too." The city's reporters began to dig deeper, uncovering stories from nurses, producers, and even fans who had unknowingly crossed paths with him during those difficult years. One nurse recalled seeing him bring a portable recorder to his treatments, chatting into the mic between infusions, describing the hum of hospital machines as if it were part of a new song. He said sound made him feel alive, she remembered, even the bad ones. Meanwhile, local news outlets began piecing together his final months, like chapters in a mystery novel not of crime, but of courage. They traced how he had recorded that 12-minute message months before his death, making sure it would be ready for his family to play. Pierre had meticulously scripted the audio file, even including the static transition to mimic a live radio sign-on. He'd wanted his goodbye to feel authentic, like another morning broadcast. Behind the scenes, his family had quietly coordinated with WMMR's engineers to honor that wish. His daughter had known about the message, but not the second surprise that would emerge later. The file labeled, "For my listeners." At first, no one paid much attention to that hard drive sitting among his personal belongings. But as journalists, fans, and producers continued their search for meaning, his daughter began sorting through his digital archives. She found folders named things like morning ideas, coffee notes, and favorite songs to die to. The last one, darkly humorous in that unmistakable Pierre way. When she opened the folder titled "For My Listeners," her hands reportedly shook. Inside were dozens of audio snippets, fragments of thoughts recorded at different times. Some were test messages, others were reflections. But at the very end was one long, unedited 25-minute file. It had no title, no timestamps, only a note on a sticky label. "Play this if they still miss me." That single sentence would soon ignite another wave of emotion across the city. Before releasing anything publicly, WMMR's leadership invited Pierre's family and close colleagues to gather in the studio one last time. It was the same booth where he had spent most of his adult life, the walls lined with posters of The Beatles, The Who, and Bruce Springsteen. His coffee mug still sat by the mixing console, stained and chipped from years of use. The microphone, his lifeline, was polished but untouched. When the file played, silence fell. It wasn't a goodbye message. It was something else entirely, a love letter disguised as a monologue. Pierre spoke candidly, with warmth and humor. "Hey there, beautiful people," he began, echoing his signature greeting. "If you're hearing this, I'm still with you somewhere between the noise and the silence." He reflected on his life, his fans, and his city. He thanked the cab drivers who listened on their morning routes, the single parents who told him his laughter kept them company, and the teenagers who discovered rock through his playlists. "Every time one of you turned the dial my way," he said, "I got to exist a little longer. That's better than any medicine." By the time the message ended, even the most seasoned producers were in tears. They knew instantly that the world needed to hear it. WMMR began preparing a special broadcast. They cleaned up the audio, restored his voice, and added a soft instrumental track beneath something that felt celestial, like sunlight breaking through fog. When they aired it for the first time, the city stopped once more. Cars pulled over, offices paused. Listeners across Philadelphia turned their volume up, as if trying to hold on to the moment. The message spread like wildfire, crossing borders and languages. Within 24 hours, the clip trended globally. Listeners who had never heard of Pierre Robert were suddenly quoting his words. "I'm not gone, I'm on another frequency." It became a mantra for anyone grieving a voice they'd loved, a parent, a friend, a partner, or a favorite artist. His final message transcended radio. It became philosophy. And for investigators, journalists, and fans alike, one truth emerged from all their searching. Pierre hadn't left behind a mystery. He'd left a map, one that led straight to the heart of what connection truly means. The morning the world heard, "I'm not gone, I'm on another frequency," was the moment Pierre Robert's story transformed from grief into legend. It wasn't just a posthumous message, it was a revelation that rippled far beyond the walls of WMMR. The line became a symbol of something eternal, the idea that passion, kindness, and authenticity never die. They simply change frequency. Inside the WMMR headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from mourning to momentum. Engineers, producers, and colleagues began to see their late friend's parting gift as a mission. The audio file Pierre left behind wasn't just a heartfelt farewell. It was layered, intentional, almost coded with the very philosophy he'd lived by. For days, producers combed through the raw recording, listening frame by frame. They realized the message wasn't spontaneous. Pierre had written it like a broadcast script, down to every pause and transition. But within the pauses, subtle clues emerged, soft background sounds, faint song intros, snippets of him humming tunes that hadn't been heard in years. When isolated through studio equipment, the tracks revealed something unexpected. He'd embedded references to people, memories, and places that mattered most to him. Snatches of laughter from past interviews, clips of fans calling into his show, even the sound of rain against the studio window. It was as if he had woven his entire life, his frequency, into one last piece of audio art. It wasn't an accident, it was a composition. One of the producers, John Casper, who had worked alongside Pierre for decades, described that realization in an emotional interview. "We thought we were listening to a farewell message, but the deeper we went, the more we realized Pierre wasn't saying goodbye. He was teaching us how to listen." He turned his last words into music. Soon after, Pierre's daughter shared another discovery: a worn, leather-bound notebook labeled Waves. Inside were handwritten reflections, sketches of radio dials, and poetic notes about sound and silence. One page stood out, dated just a few weeks before his passing. It read, "When the mic turns off, it's not the end. It's just static. The signal still travels. Someone, somewhere, will pick it up." That line would become the cornerstone of the Pierre Project, a multi-part tribute series that WMMR and the city of Philadelphia would launch to celebrate his life. But more than that, it gave fans something to hold on to, something to believe in. Pierre had always been a voice that made people feel less alone. Now, even in death, he was still doing that. Across the city, murals began to appear, bright, vibrant depictions of Pierre in his tie-dye shirt, surrounded by swirling sound waves painted in electric blues and oranges. Artists scrawled his quote beneath, "Keep talking, beautiful people." The imagery spread across social media, turning grief into a kind of shared healing. But the real breakthrough, the one that reached beyond sentiment, came when a local sound engineer named Alex Torres began experimenting with Pierre's final broadcast frequencies. Using advanced sound visualization software, he discovered that Pierre's recording, when converted into a spectrogram, actually contained visual patterns, waveforms that resembled radio towers, lightning bolts, and the outline of the city's skyline. It was as if Pierre had painted Philadelphia in sound. Whether intentional or coincidental didn't matter. To the people who loved him, it was a message from beyond. Proof that Pierre Robert's frequency still existed somewhere in the invisible hum of the world. The story went viral. Major outlets like Rolling Stone and NPR picked it up. Headlines read, "The DJ who never signed off." Pierre Robert's final broadcast still echoes through Philadelphia. A farewell that became a love letter to sound. Fans around the world, many who had never even heard of WMMR, began tuning in to replays of his old shows. Podcasts dissected his philosophy on connection and creativity. Musicians wrote songs sampling his final words. One indie artist released a track called "Another Frequency," blending his famous line with ambient jazz, and it charted on streaming platforms within days. For Pierre's family, this sudden global attention was bittersweet. His daughter, still grieving, found herself both comforted and overwhelmed by messages pouring in from listeners across continents. Some wrote about how his voice had helped them through depression. Others said they'd rediscovered their love of radio because of him. During a live interview, she said softly, "Dad always believed that radio was more than entertainment. He said it was a lifeline, invisible threads connecting people who might never meet. And now, I think he's proving it." At that moment, the interviewer paused, visibly moved. Then he said something that would go on to define the next phase of the story. Pierre spent his life sending signals into the air. Maybe now, we're the ones meant to keep transmitting them. That line sparked the beginning of the Pierre Robert Foundation for Broadcasting Arts, created in partnership with WMMR. The foundation's mission was to fund scholarships and mentorships for young voices in radio people who dreamed of carrying the same passion Pierre had for storytelling and connection. Within weeks, donations poured in from listeners, musicians, and even rival radio stations. The first annual Keep Talking Gala was scheduled for October 26th, what the mayor officially declared as Pierre Robert Day in Philadelphia. And when that day arrived, something extraordinary happened. At exactly 9:33 a.m., a nod to 93.3 WMMR, every major radio station in the city went silent for 10 full seconds. Then, softly, Pierre's voice filled the airwaves. "Good morning, beautiful people." It wasn't planned as part of the gala. No one claimed responsibility for airing it. Engineers checked their systems and found no playback files queued. Some said it was an old rerun triggered by coincidence. Others believed it was a final gift, one last moment of connection that defied explanation. Either way, the city stopped once again. For 10 seconds, silence united millions. And then, his voice reminded them of what they already knew. Pierre Robert was still here. Not as a ghost, but as an echo. A presence. A frequency carried in every sound wave that touched the city he loved. That was the breakthrough. The realization that the story of Pierre Robert wasn't about death at all. It was about continuity, the kind that defies time, science, and silence. And as the sun set over Philadelphia that night, the neon sign outside WMMR flickered to life once more, the same words glowing softly through the darkness. "Keep talking, Pierre." For most true crime stories, the arrest and confession marks the turning point, the moment truth collides with justice, and the lies that haunted a case finally unravel. But in Pierre Robert's story, there was no criminal to capture, no suspect in handcuffs. The conflict here was not between people, it was between silence and sound, between loss and legacy. Pierre's death had created a vacuum, a hollow quiet that seemed to stretch through every hallway of WMMR. Yet even that silence carried an undercurrent, as if his presence lingered just beyond perception. And in a way, that's exactly what people began to feel. The city of Philadelphia had lost a man, but it had gained a phenomenon. After the eerie reappearance of Pierre's voice on multiple radio frequencies, theories began to swirl, not of paranormal mysteries, but of human devotion. Someone, somewhere, was keeping his memory alive in ways that felt almost supernatural. The question was who. WMMR's technical team began an internal review, convinced that one of their engineers had inserted Pierre's voice into a broadcast as a tribute, but log files showed no trace of it. There were no preloaded files, no automation commands, no signals routed from their servers. The station director, Mark Jameson, recalled staring at the blank playback history on the console and whispering, he really did find another frequency. At first, fans speculated that maybe this was Pierre's final prank, the ultimate encore, designed long before his passing. After all, he had always joked on air that if there was life after death, he'd come back through the radio, not the clouds. But when another broadcast anomaly happened, a faint echo of Pierre's laughter caught during a live show weeks later, it no longer felt like coincidence. For those who knew him, it was a reminder of his essence, playful, unpredictable, forever in tune with the frequencies of life. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of his legacy was pressing hardest on his family. His daughter, Emily, had inherited not just her father's voice, but his mission. She found herself pulled into his world, meeting with the Foundation's board, managing tributes, and appearing in interviews that blurred grief and gratitude. She once said in a televised conversation, "It's strange losing someone whose voice is everywhere. I can't escape him, but I wouldn't want to. Every time I turn on the radio, I hear him telling me to keep talking." But privately, Emily wrestled with something deeper, the emotional paradox of public grief. Every tribute, every mural, every replay of his voice reminded her of what she had lost. The Foundation's first gala was a triumph, but behind the smiles there was exhaustion. The attention, while honoring, felt relentless. Then came what some would call Pierre's confession. A local journalist, digging into the background of Pierre's final recordings, discovered something extraordinary in his private archives, a set of unpublished audio diaries spanning his last 2 years. They were never meant for broadcast. The files were raw, unedited, and painfully honest. Pierre talking to himself late at night in the studio, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. In one recording dated 6 months before his death, his voice was quiet, measured, almost confessional. "You know, I've been thinking about silence lately. People fear it. They think it means the end of something. But silence is just space. It's where the next sound begins. Maybe one day, when I'm gone, they'll realize that I never stopped talking. I just changed how I was heard. It was as close to a confession as he ever made, not of guilt or regret, but of acceptance. He understood what was coming. He knew his voice would outlive him. And he prepared for that transition with the same care he once prepared his morning playlists. When this discovery became public, it shifted the entire narrative around his death. The story wasn't about a sudden loss anymore. It was about intention. A man who lived long enough to orchestrate his own farewell with precision, poetry, and grace. The tapes revealed that Pierre had been deeply ill during his final months. He'd recorded them during sleepless nights after chemotherapy sessions, seeking solace in the hum of the studio equipment. He spoke of fear, not of dying, but of being forgotten. He said, "If I can leave behind one thing, one sound, one memory that makes someone smile on a bad morning, then that's my confession. I lived for connection, and I have no apologies." Those words, "I have no apologies," became the unofficial motto of his foundation. It was painted across the walls of the WMMR control room, engraved into the brass plate of his memorial microphone, and tattooed by dozens of fans who saw it as a testament to living authentically. But perhaps the most moving part of this phase in Pierre's story came from the city itself. Reporters began to notice something strange, an almost symbolic pattern in the days following the release of his audio diaries. Street performers began playing "Here Comes the Sun" near landmarks connected to him. Radio hosts in rival cities opened their shows with his iconic greeting. Podcasts quoted him. His words became gospel among creators, a reminder that passion wasn't about fame, but connection. Even the Philadelphia Police Department joined in, broadcasting his sign-off, "Good morning, beautiful people," over the dispatch frequency one morning as a citywide salute. The officers said it was meant to remind everyone that every shift deserves a song. And so, Pierre's confession was complete not in the form of sorrow, but of surrender. A man who had spent his life amplifying others finally turned his voice inward, leaving behind truth without embellishment. He admitted his fears, his flaws, his fatigue, and in doing so, freed himself from them. For the people of Philadelphia, it was catharsis. For Emily, it was closure. She said during a live tribute broadcast, "Dad didn't hide his pain. He turned it into a signal, and now it's our turn to carry it forward." The crowd in the studio erupted in applause, tears glistening in the dim studio light. What began as a tragedy had evolved into something extraordinary, a shared act of resilience. There was no villain, no confession of crime, only a confession of humanity. Pierre Robert's life wasn't about endings. It was about the spaces between the static, where meaning waits to be found. In the weeks and months that followed the release of Pierre Robert's private recordings, something remarkable began to happen. The city of Philadelphia, the city he had loved so fiercely, the one whose mornings he had filled for more than 4 decades, began to pulse again. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. It was quieter, deeper, threaded through with a kind of reverence. On street corners where once he had broadcast live during festivals, people now gathered with portable radios, tuning in to old episodes. They'd sit in cars or on stoops, eyes closed, letting his voice roll through the air like a familiar friend returning home. In diners, cab stands, and record stores, his laugh still broke through the speakers at odd hours. WMMR had turned his entire catalog into a continuous memorial broadcast called The Frequency of Pierre. Every day at dawn and dusk, the station played his greeting, "Good morning, beautiful people," a ritual that had become sacred. And yet, the most powerful part of his aftermath wasn't what happened on the radio. It was what happened in people's lives. Listeners who had never met him wrote letters describing how Pierre had carried them through divorce, depression, loneliness, or the simple grind of getting up every day to face a world that didn't always listen back. One woman wrote, He was the first voice I heard after my husband died. I didn't turn off the radio for a week. I couldn't stand the silence. He kept me company until I could breathe again. At the WMMR studio, his workspace was left untouched. The chair still bore the faint impression of his posture. His coffee mug chipped on one side, the handle worn from years of use, sat exactly where he'd left it. Above the console, the brass plate glimmered in soft light. "Keep talking, Pierre." That phrase became more than a slogan. It became a citywide mantra. Murals went up on brick walls and overpasses, his face painted in vibrant tie-dye hues, surrounded by sound waves that rippled outward like halos. Beneath each mural were the words, "I'm not gone, I'm on another frequency." The Pierre Robert Foundation, launched only days after his funeral, began awarding scholarships to young broadcasters and musicians. Applicants were asked to submit not a resume, but a recording 1 minute of their voice describing why connection mattered. Hundreds of submissions poured in, each one echoing Pierre's influence. One finalist said through tears, "He made radio feel human again. That's the kind of voice I want to be." But for Pierre's family, the aftermath was more complicated. His daughter Emily, though proud of her father's legacy, found herself caught between celebration and grief. Everywhere she went, someone recognized her at the grocery store, at concerts, even while walking her dog. Strangers hugged her, thanked her, told her stories about what Pierre's words had meant to them. It was comforting and exhausting. As she told a journalist months later, "It's strange grieving for someone who still talks to you every day. I turn on the radio and there he is alive, laughing, rambling about music. And for a second, I forget." She wasn't alone in that feeling. Thousands of listeners across the country reported the same uncanny sense that he hadn't really gone anywhere. In moments of doubt, people swore they heard his catchphrase bleed faintly through static between stations. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. But in a city that had built its identity around sound, the illusion was enough to heal. Philadelphia responded in the only way it knew how, by making the tribute louder. Each year, on October 26th, now officially Pierre Robert Day rival radio stations joined forces. For 1 minute at exactly 9:33 a.m., they all went silent. No ads, no songs, no voices. Just 60 seconds of citywide quiet, followed by a single clip. Pierre saying, "If you can still hear my voice, then I'm still with you." The first time it happened, even the mayor wept. It became tradition, a ritual of shared silence, followed by joy. That evening, concerts filled the parks and streets, bands playing Pierre's favorite anthems, while the crowd sang along. The finale was always the same. "Here Comes the Sunday." The song that had once closed his broadcasts now closed every memorial, a reminder that endings, like dawns, are only beginnings in disguise. In the broader world of broadcasting, his influence only grew. Young radio hosts began adopting his style, unscripted, unpolished, authentic. Stations across the country created Pierre Hours, segments dedicated to free-form storytelling and audience connection. Podcast hosts cited him as their inspiration, saying his warmth had set the template for modern listener engagement. His story became a case study in media schools, the man who made radio feel human. Professors dissected his shows, pointing out how he blurred the line between art and companionship. His funeral message, the now famous final broadcast, was archived in the Library of Congress as an artifact of cultural history. For all the accolades and tributes, though, what mattered most was how personal his legacy remained. A delivery driver named Chris said it best in an interview for a local documentary. "I never met the man, but he knew me. He knew what mornings felt like, and that made me feel seen." By the first anniversary of his passing, Philadelphia had changed. Not in infrastructure or policy, but in spirit. The city had learned something from Pierre's example, that kindness, when amplified, could move through generations like music itself. On that anniversary morning, Emily sat alone in her father's studio before sunrise. The on-air light was still. The equipment hummed softly. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered into the microphone, "Good morning, beautiful people." For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly through the monitors, came her father's recorded voice from an old tape, perfectly timed. "Good morning, sweetheart." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she smiled. The circle was complete. Pierre had taught her, and all of Philadelphia, that love doesn't vanish, it transmits. It changes frequency, but it never stops. There are moments when silence speaks louder than any song, and for Philadelphia, that silence, the one that followed Pierre Robert's final broadcast, became sacred. Yet within it lived a resonance that has never truly faded. It hums softly beneath every radio static, in every sunrise over the city skyline, and in the laughter of the thousands he left behind. Pierre Robert's story isn't one of death. It's one of endurance, of voice, of heart, and of legacy. For more than 40 years, he wasn't just a name on the FM dial. He was the connective tissue of an entire city. He gave Philadelphia a soundtrack, yes, but more importantly, he gave it a heartbeat. To understand why his loss shook people so deeply, you have to understand what he stood for. In an era of automation and algorithms, Pierre was human to the core, flawed, spontaneous, wildly passionate. He tripped over his words, told stories that spiraled into tangents, and laughed until he coughed on air. But that was his magic. He made listeners feel like they were part of something unscripted, something alive. Every mistake became a melody. Every pause, a reminder that there was a real person behind the microphone. A man who believed that connection, not perfection, was the soul of broadcasting. Even now, his philosophy reverberates far beyond Philadelphia. Around the world, radio hosts and podcasters quote his wisdom. Never fake passion, people can hear it. They play his clips during live sessions and cite him as the man who proved that authenticity is timeless. In classrooms, media students analyze the cadence of his tone, the vulnerability in his laughter. They learn that it wasn't the words that made Pierre legendary, it was the feeling behind them. In homes across America, his final message, "I'm not gone, I'm on another frequency," has become a mantra. It's painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, whispered by fans who still wake up to his voice through old recordings. It's a phrase that captures something universal, that the human spirit doesn't vanish, it just transforms. Like music, it lingers in the air, waiting for someone to tune in. And that's what makes Pierre's story not just a local tribute, but a global parable. Because behind every tragedy, behind every loss, there's a deeper question. How do we keep what matters alive? Pierre answered it in his own way, not through fame, not through fortune, but through consistency. Day after day, morning after morning, he showed up. He shared himself, his joy, his doubts, his weird humor, his tears, until a city fell in love with the sound of being seen. When WMMR transformed his studio into a permanent memorial, it wasn't to preserve an artifact. It was to remind everyone who passed through those doors of a simple truth, that storytelling is sacred. On one wall, engraved in soft brass, are the words Pierre wrote in his private journal years before his death. Radio isn't about the voice, it's about the listening. That idea that empathy is the true art form has become the heartbeat of this channel, the final footage. Like Pierre, we believe every story deserves to be heard, every voice remembered. Whether it's a crime victim whose story was forgotten, a musician whose final song went unheard, or a voice like Pierre's that transcended time itself, we are here to keep those frequencies alive. In telling Pierre's story, we're not just saying goodbye to a broadcaster, we're celebrating the eternal nature of human connection. Because grief, as Pierre once said, is just love with nowhere to go. But love, when shared through sound, always finds its way back. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it. The hum of the city before dawn. The first guitar chord of "Here Comes the Sunday," the soft crackle of the mic warming up, and then that unmistakable greeting, rising like light through fog. Good morning, beautiful people. That greeting wasn't just for listeners in Philadelphia. It's for all of us. Anyone who has ever needed a voice to remind them they're not alone. And so, as we close this story, we invite you to take a moment wherever you are, whoever you are, to tune in, to listen, to remember that connection doesn't end when the broadcast stops. It lingers, it echoes, and it keeps us human. Because that's what this channel, The Final Footage, is all about. We don't chase sensationalism, we chase truth. We don't tell stories to shock, we tell them to heal. And we don't let silence mean the end. We let it mean there's more to hear. If Pierre Robert's voice meant something to you, if his laughter ever got you through a rough morning, if his passion reminded you to keep going, or if his final words reminded you that love never dies, then carry that light forward. Share it, speak it, live it. And if you believe stories like his should continue to be told, stories that honor humanity, resilience, and the power of connection, then we invite you to become part of this mission. Subscribe to The Final Footage, turn on notifications, join our growing community of people who believe that remembrance is the highest form of respect. Because every voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. Every life, no matter how fleeting, leaves a frequency behind. And every goodbye carries within it the promise of another hello. Pierre Robert once said, "If you can still hear my voice, I'm still with you." He was right. Because here, on this channel, stories like his never fade. They keep playing. This has been The Final Footage.